Welcome to this edition of the webinar series of our Committee on the Present Danger China, in which we explore the cumulative effects as well as some of the specific details of China's unrestricted warfare against America. We are going to be talking today about the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, which occurred 37 years ago this week. And we're going to talk in particular about not just the horror that massacre of tens of thousands of Chinese citizens by their government, what that represented. We're going to talk as well about how the United States government under President George H.W. Bush responded to this epic crime against humanity. Well, the short form of it is that President Bush sent his national security advisor to Beijing to meet with and, well, I would say kowtow to Deng Xioping, the man at the time, the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, who was ultimately responsible for the order to murder en masse unarmed, innocent citizens of his country, both in Tiananmen Square, where they were demonstrating for a protracted period of time, and in the course of which they had erected a kind of homage to our Statue of Liberty, but also elsewhere across China. The brutality of that crime, as well as the extent of it, did not dissuade President Bush, who had been the ambassador to China, I think it'd be fair to say, was an old friend of China, a phrase the Communist Party uses to describe those who are, well, captured elites. President Bush's message through General Scowcroft was pretty straightforward. We, of course, don't like what was done in connection with the murder of innocent Chinese, but we're not going to let it interfere with business as usual. That episode helped to propel to new heights what had been pretty much the leitmotif of the opening to China going back to 1972, when first Henry Kissinger and then his boss, Richard Nixon, made their own pilgrimages to Beijing and began a process justified at the time in the Cold War by the need to play the China card against the Soviet Union, of engaging in a very comprehensive way to help build up the Chinese in both commercial and military ways. And that process, begun back in 1972, again, became a floor for what then assumed epic proportions during the post-Tiananmen period, especially under Bill Clinton. We're going to talk about what that looked like. It might be called the embrace of the Chinese Communist Party, with some of the best experts of our Committee on the Present Danger China and its allies. In the course of this program, we're going to talk about what that entailed and what it precipitated in terms of, among other things, the immense buildup of China's military capabilities, as well as its economic competitiveness and ultimately threat to the United States of America. To begin, as we often do in these webinars, we are going to take stock with one of our most acclaimed, most accomplished intelligence professionals, Captain James Fennell, United States Navy, retired. He served, among other things, as the Chief of Intelligence and Information Operations in the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Since taking off his uniform, he has remained very active in raising the alarm about the Chinese Communist Party, the threat that it poses to us, particularly the emergence of the People's Liberation Army as a menace to not only Taiwan, but to us and freedom-loving people everywhere. I had a chance to speak with Captain Fennell as part of an interview I conducted with him the other day on our program, Securing America. You can find it at Real America's Voice. He kindly gave us permission to excerpt part of it for the purpose of contributing to this webinar, and we are delighted to be able to do so. Now, I want to do that with one further recognition. Captain Fennell and our colleague, Dr. Bradley Thayer, co-authored an incredibly important and very relevant book entitled Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure. We'll find out why right now.
What happened in 1989 reverberates through to today, because it should have been an event where Nixon and Kissinger went to China in 71, and Jimmy Carter formally switched recognition from Taipei in Taiwan to Beijing and the People's Republic of China. So from 1979 on, you could say, well, we thought that, China was weak. China was but had access to the weak underbelly of the Soviet Union, who we were in a death match with, a death struggle to see who was going to win. As President Reagan said, we win, you die, essentially to the Soviets. We're not going to treat them we're not going to have detente with them. We have to defeat them. So we were engaging with them. And you could say, well, right, in 79, maybe that made some sense. And we did it for a decade. But in 1989, with the murder of at least 10,000 of their own citizens that was displayed to the world on this new thing called CNN, we got to see it. We got to see the tank man. We got to see the carnage. We got to see the democracy statue that the students just wanted to have the ability to express their own feelings. And we got to see what the Chinese Communist Party's real intentions are and how they really are beside this cloaked, non-transparent government that they are. And so what happened then should have been a signal for us and for the current administration at the time, which is the Bush administration, and following administrations to question whether or not we should be so close to and engaging with the Chinese Communist Party as we were. That should have been a warning signal to the national security apparatus of America. And, the State Department, the Defense Department then, our Capitol Hill, the representatives that represent you and I and American citizens from threats outside of our shores. We should have said, hold on a minute, this seems a little bit off script. Let's tap the brakes on this. And instead, we did the exact opposite. We sent over some diplomats, Brent Scowcroft and Larry Eagleburger, and we kind of gave them the assurances that, hey, what you're doing is, a little bit out of bounds here for the rest of the world. So back off a bit and we can still continue to work with you. And what did we do? We invited them we gave them most favored nation status. We invited them to the World Trade Organization. We allowed them into the currency as a reserve currency, all without the normal protocols that any other country would have had to achieve and meet, the standards of being allowed into the World Trade Organization. There are certain economic criteria that the Chinese Communist Party and the PRC didn't meet. Same with the currency basket. They did not meet those standards. They did not meet the standards for most favored nation status. And we allowed them to come in and we embraced them. We worked with them. And now we're sitting in this position now 37 years later where they're threatening us. They're threatening us to withhold rare earth elements. They're threatening to withhold our pharmaceuticals that are needed for people's lives to be able to live. If you need whatever medicine that you require to live, they have that control on. They have their hand around the throat of that. And the rare earth elements I mentioned, they're using their military to threaten us in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, threaten our allies, friends in Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, all over. Australia's, when their ships are up transiting around, they get threatened. Canadians get threatened. So China is a bad actor on the world stage. They're using debt trap diplomacy to expand this Belt and Road Initiative. and they're a malign actor when it comes to supporting Russia's war in Ukraine or China's activities in Africa, the South America, economic coercion, and they're using the tools of the United Nations and other forums to be able to achieve their goal. And they will stop at nothing to achieve their goal, which is to become the world's global superpower. And they want to see America displaced, even though every day in their press they say, we're not targeting any single country, we're not targeting any third nation, but we know that they are by their actions. And so this day is a solemn reminder that we should never have forgotten what Chinese Communist Party really stands for, and we should never be duped again into thinking embracing them is going to make everything better, and that we're going to, all of a sudden, all of us get along and we're going to buy, sell, and trade and everything's going to be good. That is not the way the Chinese Communist Party is indoctrinated into their brains, into their DNA. And it doesn't matter if it's Mao or Deng Xioping, it doesn't matter if it's Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin or now Xi Jinping. They all are essentially on the same sheet for their objectives. And they may change tactics in some places here and there, but their ultimate goal is to destroy the United States. And we should know that. And this day should be, a reminder to all of America what they did and what they're capable of doing, not just to their citizens, but what they want to do to us in order to achieve their goal. But we see what they're doing, Frank, to people like Jimmy Lai or those two Canadian, the two Michaels. You're going to be put in solitary confinement. You're going to be bombarded with propaganda, light 24 hours a day or darkness 24 hours a day. You're going to have things projected into your ears. Just in those special cases, they do that. In other cases, like with the Uyghurs that we saw in Hong Kong a few years ago, where they were rounding them up and shipping them out to prisons, mass incarceration. And in other cases, like they've done in their past, they're willing to just mow people down and destroy them that way. So there was nothing, they had no moral compulsion to stop doing what they want to do in their agenda. The Chinese Communist Party wants Taiwan for many, many reasons, but mostly it's, from my perspective, the military perspective. It allows China to be unfettered from what they consider to be these chains around their neck, especially the first island chain, coming down from Japan through the Ryukyu Islands, through Taiwan, and then down into the Philippine archipelago. They have written extensively over the years about how they feel those island chains kind of lock them in from being able to get their military out into the Western Pacific to be able to challenge the U.S. initially, but then to be able to send their fleets and aircraft around the world. Now, the military side of it, obviously economics. We know about the importance of the chip industry in Taiwan. It's just leading the world in advanced chip manufacturing and some other things as well. And then thirdly, there's this symbolic Taiwan represents Han Chinese ethnicity that's able to function as a democracy, to have opposing political parties, to be able to argue and debate and still function as a society and have a very successful economy and successful society. And those are all things that stick in their eye. So over the last, especially since Xi's been in power for the last 14 years, he has been really propagandizing the importance of historic connections that the PRC has with Taiwan. And so they would prefer to be able to get it without firing a single shot. But as I have written and we've talked about on this show, time is marching on, and they know that they want to have a big party in 2049 to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. And so there's growing pressure, and we're seeing it manifest in the last 4 years as China's ramped up their military operations around Taiwan. Even today, I just read something just now that says that from China's just sent a whole nother high-level number of aircraft and ships around Taiwan. The second highest of the year just occurred. I know they're doing it in kind of relationship to Tiananmen Square, but they're sending the signal that if they don't get a political solution, a nonviolent, non-kinetic solution to restoring Taiwan to China, that they're going to use force. And they have prepared a military force to do that. And when they do that, if they were to do that, everything changes for America, both across those three main areas I talked about. Militarily, we will be in a very dire situation. Our allies in Japan will be in a dire situation. Our allies in Philippines will be in a dire situation. Taiwan will be gone. Economically, we will have lost all chip manufacturing, and China will control the world's chip manufacturing. Another stranglehold that can crush our economy, which is, obviously another major facet of them being able to achieve global domination. And then lastly, it shows the world in a kind of a information diplomatic sense, cognitive warfare sense, that it'll just show, hey, America's nothing. America couldn't even defend Taiwan, little old Taiwan. They couldn't stop us. We are unstoppable. And the tide of history, they will say, is on their side. They'll, bring out Graham Allison to give more speeches on the Thucydides trap about their rising power. We're a declining power. And if we don't want a war, then we better accept that fact. That's what they're trying to do to us. That's what they're preaching. And unfortunately, a lot too many people in America, especially in our national security arena, buy into that. And so it would be massively different. I mean, it would be on steroids if they were able to take Taiwan. And our presence in the Western Pacific would be at risk. And that would be devastating. As Steve Bannon says, we are, and everyone should know, we are a Pacific nation. America's been a Pacific nation for a couple of centuries. We are a nation that's engaged in the Pacific. And if we are cut out of the Pacific, that'll have devastating consequences that will be reflected at Main Street USA, where things will not be available, prices will be dramatically higher, your dollar will be worth nothing, and you will be at risk from the threat of a potential military action or a non-kinetic military action. Your bank accounts could be zeroed out by Chinese cyber hackers. Infrastructure could be destroyed. We could have power outages, the likes that we've seen in Venezuela or elsewhere.
Thank you, Captain Fennell. As always, your insights are tremendously appreciated, especially in the synthesizing that you do of these various dimensions of the threat we face from China and how it has been enabled by what the Chinese call captured elites in the United States. We're going to get another take on this from another of our intelligence professionals. That would be Charles Sam Faddis. Sam is a man who has served undercover as an intelligence clandestine service operative of the CIA in some of the most dangerous places in the world. He has some profoundly important life experiences that we found very important to the work of our Committee on the Present Danger, of which he is also, as with Captain Fennell, a very important member. We're going to take stock with him through another video contribution from another edition of our Securing America program. Let's go to Sam Faddis at this juncture, please.
I'm one of those who believes, and smarter people than I have characterized it this way, the greatest single strategic mistake the United States ever made in its history. Self-inflicted one was our decision to embrace the CCP, entangle ourselves economically with the communist Chinese. As I've said many times, it was sold to the American people as we're going to liberalize and democratize them. I quite frankly am not convinced that anybody ever really believed that, and that wasn't just an effective marketing technique. But the bottom line is, the evidence is clearly in, right? The jury has come in on that. Obviously, that didn't work. We didn't make them more liberal or more democratic or soften them. We just made them really wealthy and really strong, and we keep feeding the dragon that may ultimately devour us. And I get it that we cannot turn the giant supertanker that is the U.S. on a dime and immediately steer away at this point after decades. But I think we absolutely have to say, as a matter of policy, that is what we are doing, and that is the direction, and set that course and not give it a second thought. We have to disentangle. We have to fundamentally change this relationship. What has it wrought? I mean, it's catastrophic damage, right? Economically, we have gutted our industrial base. I mean, the industry that won the Second World War doesn't exist anymore. We struggle to produce handfuls of warships. The country that produced Liberty ships at a feverish rate, every couple of days, another one was sliding into the water. And we now are years and years and years behind on shipbuilding. My God, we had a nuclear attack sub down in Norfolk that literally waited a decade for refurbishment and refit. And we recently had to announce that we were scuttling it. We're decommissioning it. It will never return to the fleet. What's the number one reason? We don't physically have the space and the workers to do the work. It's not that we don't know how to do the work. We don't have a place to do the work. That's how bad it is. On the Intel side, which is obviously closer to my old line of work, I was struck recently because I'm reading finally in its entirety the Venona papers, which is essentially a pretty lengthy book that goes through all of the now declassified, decrypted communications regarding the Soviet espionage activity on our soil, particularly in the run-up to the Second World War, but then to some extent afterward, right? And when you read the Venona papers, you're just struck by the fact that, literally you had Soviet spies on the streets of Washington fighting over who got to recruit the next American government official. They would literally be trying to recruit one guy, and the guy would say, well, but somebody else already propositioned to me. This sounds like a Woody Allen movie or something. And then they'd all three have to get together and realize that the Russians had so many guys running around on the streets in D.C., they had lost track of who was recruiting whom, and they were fighting over who to recruit. And these are not guys on the sidewalk. These are senior State Department officials. They had penetrated us 50 ways from Sunday. Of course, they had crawled inside the Manhattan Project. And as I was reading it, I'm thinking, the Russians are pikers. Man, that's nothing compared to the way the Chinese are. You every once in a while somebody focuses on Eric Swalwell or somebody like that's an espionage case. You're like, okay, but that's not the question. That Swalwell was recruited by the Chinese. Apparently, the question is, how many Eric Swalwells are there in Congress? Can you even count them? And down to the level of mayors and state legislators, and these are just these are formal recruitments in the intel sense. They're getting paid and being run as assets. Then we move on to what you referenced in your question, which is, okay, but for every one of those guys, how many American billionaires at this point have chosen a side, and they're not necessarily being paid directly in the sense of run as assets by the Chinese, but they picked a side and they picked the Chinese, and they're in bed with the Chinese now. Larry Fink and company, they have taken our money and made the Chinese powerful, and they're making a boatload of cash. And in the meantime, they're getting filthy rich. And I presume on some level, they're intelligent enough to understand that at the end of the day, this turns out very badly for the United States, but I guess they figure, well, probably not in my lifetime in any way they like me. So, this is self-destructive behavior. That's where we are. We are destroying ourselves as a nation, and the obvious, as I said at the beginning, the obvious answer here is a fundamental change in our policies. Steer away from these guys and back toward treating them the way we treated the Soviet Union during the whole.
Sam, let me just ask you to add, that was fabulous, one other piece to all of this, and that is what this enabling has translated into in terms of just sheer military threat to our country as well.
Yeah, well, massive, right? Look, the immediate let's just pick an example. The immediate flashpoint is Taiwan, obviously. Chinese have been about as transparently obvious as you can be about that. They look at it the same way they looked at Tibet, which doesn't really exist as an independent entity anymore. They are locked and loaded, and every day they're adding to their arsenal. So anybody who doesn't understand that we are perilously close to not being able to protect Taiwan, or maybe we already tipped over that edge, is not tracking the rump. I mean, we are right there where the Chinese could, in fact, invade, and we can't stop them. And it's not just Taiwan, not that that's not catastrophic enough, because if you look at the economic implications of Taiwan falling, you crash the world economy. But the rest of East Asia and the whole world watches Taiwan being taken. What does that mean for the South Koreans, the Japanese, everybody in Southeast Asia, everywhere? And obviously, potentially at some point, the Taiwanese make the calculation and just decide, we're not going down with the ship, and they take the Hong Kong solution. They say, yeah, we'll submit and spare the destruction of the island being destroyed.
It's absolutely chilling, and I think your admonitions, of course, are absolutely dead on. What I guess I'd just conclude this particular, part of our conversation with Sam is this treason? What is being done by these captured elites? You mentioned billionaires. There were 13 or 17 or something on the plane with President Trump when he went to China. Every one of them is an old friend of China. Every one of them has made money, as you say, and sold out.
I certainly regard it as treason. And look, I mean, you got the head of NVIDIA standing on stage dancing, thinking this is all a blast, and he's in a nightclub because they're rolling in money while the country goes to hell. I mean, yes, they have betrayed the country.
Well, that puts a fine point on it, doesn't it? And to hear a little bit of good news about what might now be our response to this veil of tears. I should have said that Sam, by the way, is the proprietor of a wonderful online resource and magazine, which you can find at andmagazine.substack.com. Our next presenter, also an important member of our Committee on the Present Danger China, Rod Martin, is the proprietor as well of a very, very important resource online called the Rod Martin Report, and you can find it at rodmartin.org. Rod is a highly successful entrepreneur and investor, going back to time with the PayPal mafia. He is also, I'm very pleased to say, the chairman of the board of our Institute for the American Future, which sponsors the Committee on the Present Danger China and makes possible, among other things, this very important series. Rod, thank you for joining us. You and I spoke yesterday on our Securing America show, and you went through a very, very thoughtful, characteristically thoughtful, but also very insightful essay that you posted at rodmartin.org about what Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent is doing at the moment as part, we hope, of a larger Trump strategy for pushing back on the Chinese and trying to offset the damage that's been done, as we've just been hearing from Captain Pinnell and Sam Faddis. Over to you, sir.
Look, I love Sam Faddis. I just follow him religiously, and everybody ought to, and he's absolutely right about the geopolitical catastrophe that was unleashed by creating modern China. I mean, we built China. They certainly did their part, don't misunderstand. But if it hadn't been for specific actions taken, especially under the Clinton administration, China would not be in any danger of being a superpower now or ever. Actually, we built this, and that was stupid. It was, by the way, highly profitable to a great deal of the establishment in this country. So, we must not make light of that. The problem for China, and by the way, just one thing I would differ with Sam on is that I think our biggest mistake was letting China go communist in the first place. Shame on Harry Truman. He got Greece and Turkey right, and he blew China, and that was just a catastrophe, and we wouldn't have had a Korean War or a Vietnam War if it hadn't been for that mistake in 1948 and 49. So American foreign policy toward China has been fraught since the end of World War II, and that continues to be true to a degree, but only in the degree that Sam identified, which is that it takes time to turn the super tanker that is the United States. Interesting phrasing, because we had an interesting development in the immediate aftermath of the Trump-Xi summit, which is that there are now a whole bunch of super tankers carrying liquefied natural gas, or LNG, to China. That would be interesting, I guess, normally. I mean, that's a lot of money. That's great. But it happens at the exact same moment that Xi refused to allow Vladimir Putin to build a gas pipeline from Siberia, one that would significantly reduce China's dependence on the Strait of Malacca, the Strait of Hormuz, and the U.S. Navy. So what do we make of this picture? And I actually take a much brighter view of where we are here. I think we're kind of where we were in 1985. In 1985, if the Red Army had wanted to invade West Germany, there's a decent chance it could have succeeded. There's a decent chance it could have shattered NATO. There's a decent chance that we could have ended up somewhere down the line in the middle of the movie Red Dawn. I mean, it was just really dire. But they didn't. And why didn't they? Well, they had a lot of internal problems. Brezhnev died, and then Andropov died, and then Chernyenko died, and Mikhail Gorbachev is just barely on his feet by 85. And by then, the Reagan defense buildup has kicked into full steam. The American economy is kicking butt and taking names for the first time in quite a while. The 70s were just a gallstone of a decade. And all of a sudden, the world looks very different. And I think the Soviets felt very strongly that they could turn that tide at Reykjavik, and Reagan just said, "Nyet." So we end up with the INF Treaty and START and the fall of the Berlin Wall and of course the fall of the Soviet Empire. Well, smack dab in the middle of that, a few months before the fall of the wall, we have Tiananmen Square, which shows you what was possible. The Soviets certainly could have taken a Tiananmen Square approach and didn't. And why? Well, Gorbachev thought he could reform it from within. He understood the structural problems of communism while still being a communist. He understood that reform was necessary. He understood the corruption was overwhelming. He understood he needed to tackle that before he tackled us. I'm not sure that was the right call for the Soviet Union, honestly, but that was his program, and Reagan encouraged it, and it worked. The net result of that was the real reform Russia needed, the fall of communism. Now, since then, they need different reforms. That's not the point. In 1991, it was a huge victory for them and for us because they were out from under the yoke of communism, and we no longer had the Cold War. Okay. I think Trump paid very close attention to every jot and tittle of that in the 80s. There is no question. And you see it in his writings since at least 1990. You see it in some of his video appearances that surface from time to time on YouTube. And I think that's exactly what we're doing right now. So in taking Venezuela off the map, you didn't just harm China's ability to import its oil. You also start interdicting the shadow fleet for the first time. That's vital for both sides of the equation. The Iran, Venezuela, Russia side of the equation, where they're exporting illicit sanctioned oil to China to be able to stay afloat. It's vital for China because 40% of their energy imports. They are the largest energy importer in the world, and 40% of that is illicit sanctioned oil being carried on those shadow fleet tankers. Well, France just interdicted another one the other day. And, Belgium has, Sweden has, India has. We're starting to choke off this supply. That creates tremendous problems in the Chinese economy. So let's remember that in the 80s, the intelligentsia in the United States was quite certain that the Soviet Union was 10 feet tall, could do anything, and absolutely had a bigger economy than the United States. And if it didn't, it was gonna, because history was on their side. No. None of that's true. And none of that's true in China today. The truth is, China's entire export policy is an effort to export its deflation and unemployment problems to the rest of the world. Because China may look capitalist, but don't kid yourself. There's a party apparatchik in every boardroom telling these so-called private companies exactly what they may and may not do. It's a variation on the same theme that Hitler pioneered in the 30s in Nazi Germany, where they maintained the appearance of private ownership, but the reality was nationalization. That's the situation in China. And they still have a command control aspect of this. These ghost cities they've built pump up the construction sector, pump up their economic growth numbers. So impressive. What's the actual long-term net effect? Well, you just doubled the amount of housing in these areas. You just collapsed their value. Those numbers eventually catch up. And the more these contradictions appear in the system, and you see it everywhere, the high-speed rail network, it's a marvel. California would love to build such a thing. The problem, of course, is that nobody rides on those trains except a handful of routes. So this is this huge financial boondoggle that the American press is treating as a huge victory for communism. No, it's not. It's a disaster. It's an economic debacle. Now, add to that the Chinese have a total fertility rate of 0.92 and dropping. They're likely to stabilize about 0.8. That gets you a 75% population loss over the course of the rest of the century. And guess what, guys? It's not even. You lose the young working age people first, while the elderly balloon and need to be supported by those real estate investments. So that's where we are. Now, Donald Trump has flipped India. You've got meaningful cooperation with them, including interdiction of shadow fleet tankers, and instead of buying Russian gas, they're now buying American. You have a new defense pact with Indonesia. You have the Japanese supplying frigates to Australia and other arms, including warships, to the Philippines, some of those for free. You have a forest of missiles growing in Luzon. The deal we did with Taiwan in December was focused on howitzers and HIMARS to blow up landing craft in the water and on the beach. And this new deal that'll eventually get done, might be delayed a couple months, it'll happen, is air defense. But even if we don't do that deal, the Israelis are doing a deal with them for the T-Dome, which is like Iron Dome in Israel. So we suddenly have a lot of local powers who are helping us defend Taiwan in an overt way. And that creates the situation I believe we had in the 80s, which is, can they act? Yes. Will they act? They're going to hesitate because the risk is awfully high and it's getting higher. So the next few years are the dangerous part where they try to decide, hey, maybe we can still do this. But you get out a decade and this threat is probably done.
As usual, you are bringing not only powerful factual evidence to bear, but also giving us a bit more of a glass half full assessment of things.
Only half full.
The half, I'm saying the half, but full, not
yes.
empty.
Yes.
We so appreciate your contributions and look forward to a conversation with you about them with our final presenter in the course of this program, the chairman of our Committee on the Present Danger China, Brian Kennedy. Brian is, among other things, a former president of the very highly acclaimed Claremont Institute, these days the president of the American Strategy Group, the author of, among other works, China's War Inside America, and a frequent essayist, including on a subject that I encouraged him to speak about. In addition to, I hope, sort of synthesizing more generally his thoughts on the error that our Committee on the Present Danger of China has been very actively pointing out and trying to correct, namely the capture of our elites and the help that that has given to China's unrestricted warfare against us. We've asked Brian to do, as I say, his usual cleanup batting on the sort of broader topic, but also to talk about evidence that China has, in fact, taken this unrestricted war into the domain of electoral warfare, namely trying to destroy our free and fair elections. And that may just be a foretaste of what is to come. Brian Kennedy, thank you so much for joining us. We know that you were up to a moment ago talking with Steve Bannon about this. I'm so glad the timing worked out that you could be here right on cue. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Frank. Great to be with you. I enjoyed what Rod had to say. I like when someone is an optimist about these things. And I think there's some reason for optimism. But operationally, I follow the Frank Gaffney thesis that we should always be examining what is the worst case scenario, and are we preparing for that worst case scenario? And can we look out on the horizon and see a bunch of things happening that we can discern that our enemy is doing certain things that mean our destruction? And so one reason we started this Committee on the Present Danger of China, and we did that with Frank Gaffney and myself and Steve Bannon, we did that because we saw that there was an inadequate understanding of what China was doing here in the United States. And President Trump, back when we started this, was he had the right ideas, but he had an inadequate number of people supporting what he was doing and what he was arguing. The Chinese, as we've been saying, the communist Chinese, have engaged in unrestricted warfare against the United States for about a half century. They mean to win that war. And even though Rod was right to be optimistic at times, I think the ability of communist China to win that war is still quite high. And it's quite high because even though we have a lot of things going in our favor, we still have a very divided United States. And the political weakness, as it were, of our system is something that the Chinese are going to exploit wherever they can. President Trump, when he goes to China, has to bring with him, or does bring with him anyway, all those tech and industry leaders. And he does that because they're very important to the U.S. economy. These are also people, as important as they are to the U.S. economy, who don't really believe in America and what America stands for. And most of them would sell their mothers out for $1. And they'd be happy to sell the United States out to China, and quite often do. They had Jensen Huang with them from NVIDIA. And Jensen Huang would be happy to sell communist China, and presumably does sell to communist China one way or the other, very advanced chips in order to make their military and their society more capable. And so we're fighting this war with communist China at a time when many of our elites here, as Frank suggested, are not fully on the side of the United States. Now, we've always had captains of industry who, their first priority was making, a buck. That we understand. But during the Cold War, we had, the captains of industry who fully understood that American society, the American way of life, was a good thing and worth fighting and dying for. And they built great companies that were designed to make America a strong, free, and prosperous country. And as I'm suggesting, today we don't have that, or we have many fewer of those people in our country. The American people, for sure, still love their country and are willing to fight and die for it, but our elites, not so much. And President Trump is trying to engage in political, discourse here in this country at a time when you have a lot of voices who are against what he's trying to do. And so that's a big challenge. This piece I've written for Real Clear Politics that I talked about today on the War Room was really about trying to understand whether we can have fair elections today in a time where Communist China is engaged in this political war against us. They have a cyber army of 1 million men, Communist China does. It's at least the second best in the world. And so that should be of great concern. We now have artificial intelligence as well to worry about. And in the piece, I mentioned that Secretary Bessent and Chairman Powell had to call in all the major banking companies in April to the Department of Treasury in order to have a frank emergency conversation about whether we could defend our banking system, which is that there's certainly more cyber dollars put into defense of our banking system than any other system we have in the country, probably other than our nuclear weapons. Could we defend that against artificial intelligence? Could we defend it against Chinese artificial intelligence? And what would that look like? Because they were looking at models that would suggest that in a matter of minutes, you could take down with artificial intelligence a bank in the United States. Now, imagine that happening for just a moment, that a U.S. bank goes down because of artificial intelligence. You go to withdraw your money and you can't do it. This is among the most secure systems we have. That is the power of artificial intelligence combined with cyber hacking into our critical infrastructure. And I suggest in this article, if we are worried today about our most secure system, which is our money supply, as it were, what about our voting system, which is an afterthought, which has, relatively speaking, very little security around it, partly because they have this really it's gaslighting at some level, this idea that the system is not connected to the internet. Well, the system is electronic, and so at some point it's connected to the internet. There are parts that report in our electronic voting system. There are obviously parts that use the internet. There are obviously computers connected to the internet. And so we have an electronic voting system in this country that is vulnerable to cyber attack. And I would say this was not a controversial proposition as little as 2020, 6 years ago, where major Democrats, Amy Klobuchar, Ron Wyden, Elizabeth Warren, and Kamala Harris were warning about the cyber vulnerability of our voting system. Well, we had an election in 2020 that was stolen in part, I believe, because of that cyber vulnerability and the exploitation of mail-in balloting. We have a voting system today that the Chinese, in my opinion, can exploit, either through cyber penetration or through the counterfeiting, large-scale counterfeiting of mail-in ballots, which themselves are a very vulnerable way of voting. Again, this was not a controversial proposition. As little as 10 years ago, people said mail-in balloting is the most susceptible to fraud. Well, today we have a system with electronic voting and mail-in balloting that is very open to fraud. When it's Americans trying to do that, that's one thing. When you have a nation state like Communist China that has 1 million-man cyber army and a budget just for influence operations and intelligence operations of $20 billion a year in the United States, we have to take a hard look at that system and see whether or not in fact, we ought to be doing it that way. In this piece, and I recommended also in the War Room, that President Trump sign an executive order banning electronic voting on the grounds that it had cyber vulnerabilities that the U.S. government as a whole and states in particular were not capable of protecting the citizens from, and to severely limit mail-in balloting to the military and to those people who are permanently confined. Everyone else is going to need to vote in person using paper ballots, showing voter ID, and the ballots counted by human beings with other human beings watching them. The kind of thing you would do if you saw you had a vulnerable system and weren't adequately capable of defending it. The legitimacy of the U.S. Republic depends really on having elections that people can trust. And today, large numbers of Americans can't trust that. The Chinese, in my opinion, are going to exploit that. They have exploited that. Tulsi Gabbard said 18 to 12 states in 2020, their voter databases had been penetrated by the Chinese. And I speculate in this piece, well, why were they penetrated? Other than to try to influence the election, potentially through counterfeit mail-in ballots. That's the thing we're up against today. We're in a political war, Frank, with communist China. And unless we're willing to take that seriously, we run the risk that our republic is going to be undermined by communist China and their very powerful capability of being able to engage in political warfare against us, either through mail-in balloting that they're able to manipulate somehow, primarily in my view by counterfeit ballots, or by cyber penetration of our voting system, which is a very real possibility that, again, was not a controversial proposition with Republicans and Democrats until very recently. And so whatever else is true of our relations with communist China, I think we have to realize that they are a very real threat, as we've been highlighting on these webinars for 6 years now, and that we have to, whatever positives may be coming our way, we're still in a very precarious spot, and Americans need to take that very seriously, especially the president. And I would encourage folks to take a look at this essay of mine, and you could find it on our Present Danger China website. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Brian. As always, so much important content. I'm really glad that you mentioned this anomalous situation in which 4 prominent Democratic senators were expressing Brian Kennedy-esque concerns about our voting system. And this isn't just some sort of random assertion. They were in a movie called Kill Chain that came out, as I recall, in the run-up to 2020, that made it absolutely clear they knew exactly what the kinds of vulnerabilities are that you have just described. And the extent to which they got away with in the aftermath of that stolen election, using those techniques, we have reason to believe, as though that video, evidence didn't exist, is one of the most outrageous acts of, well, not just hypocrisy, but also malfeasance on the part of the press, who didn't, connect the dots. We have 2 men standing, I'm delighted to say, 2 of our best, having staked out somewhat different views on at least the overall trajectory of the war we're in. And Brian, thank you so much for making pointedly clear that among the elements of the unrestricted warfare of China, which of course is a phrase that was given to what they are doing by 2 colonels in the People's Liberation Army back in 1999, when they laid out this litany of lines of attack. And one of them was political warfare. Others of them, by the way, included not only economic warfare and various kinds of deindustrialization and so on, but biological warfare, very much like what we saw with COVID, and chemical warfare, very much like what we've been seeing with fentanyl. and a whole new, by the way, class of even more potent and more deadly opioids, synthetic opioids called nitazenes. These guys are at it across the broadest front. That's what we try to document in this program. And I just want to say thank you to both of you for contributing to so many of these programs and so helpfully. But could I just ask you both to take on this specific question, which I put to Sam Faddis? Is what we're dealing with here, when all is said and done, by those who have engaged in embracing communist China, as Captain Fennell and Brett Thayer put it, or becoming part of the captured elite, or selling us out, however you want to describe the action, does it rise to the level of treason in terms of the damage that it's been doing to us? And should there be accountability? I usually at this point hold up our copy of our book called The Indictment, which was developed from many of the first 70 or so of these webinars. We're up to, I think, 220 or so. The subtitle of it is Prosecuting the Chinese Communist Party and Friends for Crimes Against America, China, and the World. And it envisioned, among other things, prosecuting them in the court of public opinion, if not literally in Article 3 courts. But I'd be very interested in your take on this, because it seems to me it is the crux of the problem. The Chinese, yes, but the problem being caused by Americans as well, and what we need to do about that.
First of all, I want to violently agree with Brian. I know that's shocking. We have to look at the worst case scenario to know how to prevent it. And that's the aim. And that's what I'm aiming at. Are we preventing it? Is this administration doing something different that could actually prevent it? And I believe we are. I think it's going really well, actually, and actually pretty fast, which is also true of Reagan coming off of Carter, who was about to give away the entire world, not to mention the United States, to the Soviets. So, you can turn these things on a dime, but you have to be really, really deliberate about it. And I think Trump is nothing if not deliberate. As far as the traitors among us, I think most of them aren't technically traitors. The Constitution's pretty clear about what is and isn't, but some of them absolutely are. And I would encourage everybody, just briefly, go hunt down Peter Schweizer's book on this, about all the children of American politicians who have been the conduits by which the CCP has bought major American leaders. I think some of these people probably do need to be prosecuted. The rest of them need to be shamed. And, that doesn't include CEOs who just outsourced operations to China because it was massively cheaper. Our government encouraged that. That's a different thing. And I think it was foolish. I think the Europeans are figuring out now that it's foolish. That we had some interesting stuff come out of the French planning agency this week, about how Europe is going to be deindustrialized in the next 10 years at the rate it's going because of Chinese dumping. And for some in our audience who have heard that term but don't understand what it means, that's where a command and control economy is able to produce without reference to actual costs, as a result of which it undercuts the other country so much that it drives their industry trying to compete fairly out of business. They are subsidizing their industry beyond anybody's ability to grasp for this purpose, to drive Western industry under and take over huge segments of the economy. And by the way, have been very successful at this in pharmaceuticals, certainly with rare earths. They control 92% of the world's rare earth refining. This has to be opposed, and Trump is opposing it. And if the Europeans would step up and follow his example, they could avoid that deindustrialization. But a lot of that is just the natural course of business where our government was asleep at the switch. Some of our government officials were bought directly or indirectly. Peter Schweizer has a roadmap, and I would hope Kash Patel is following it.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting question, Frank, whether they're actually traitors or not. I agree with Rod that Probably legally they're not. Morally, yes, they are. Morally, they're turning this country over to communist China. How many people do you know who think in the business world, well, communist China is the future? There are 1.4 billion people, they say. I'm not sure that number is real or not, but they have 1.4 billion people. They're the future economically of the world. We have to find our place within that framework that they, the Chinese, designed. A large number of people in the business community think that. A lot of people in the political world think that. And the only man who stopped, who in the political realm anyway, who said no to that, really seriously, was Donald Trump. He said that's not going to be the way the world works. We're not going to let them design the future world. We're going to design it. But he finds himself not alone, but it's him, the American people, and people like us who defend that point of view. Much of the political world in Washington does not take communist China as a threat after all these years. Even after everything they did with COVID, even after $7 trillion worth of theft of American intellectual property, they don't take them as a threat. We have not done a good enough job as a country in understanding what the communist Chinese threat is to the United States so that it permeates both American, society more broadly, but specifically the business community and official Washington. As you'll remember, as we've highlighted, under the Biden administration, they got rid of the China desk, basically the main counterintelligence desk at the FBI looking at China. I've talked to FBI agents. They said the amount of nefarious activity by communist China in the United States is so great that it would take a quadrupling or a quintupling of our FBI today just to scratch the surface of all the bad things communist China is doing in this country. Well, I think as a people, we need to take a hard look at that. Should we have 300,000 or 400,000 or 500,000 Chinese students in our universities? They may spend $40 billion on an education here, but they're part of a network that steals $7 trillion, over the last decade of American intellectual property, about $700 billion a year annually. That's a pretty good return on investment. Again, they have their cyber army that they're able to use for the theft of American intellectual property. Are we going to sit by and let that happen, or are we going to take this seriously? That really is the job of the committee, Frank, and I think that we can't really expect that we're not going to have captains of industry who are going to exploit that until we take this more seriously as a people from the president on down. Thankfully, we have a president today, but I'm still worried about the FBI and other parts of our counterintelligence establishment that should be going after communist China and explaining to the American people just the seriousness of all this.
Well, I certainly agree with that, Brian. At the risk of doubling down, I just checked on Google search, and it turns out that treason is the only crime that is specifically defined by the Constitution in Article 3, Section 3. And it specifically describes, as evidence of that crime, levying war, waging armed uprisings against the United States, and secondly, providing aid and comfort, which goes on to be described as giving material support, intelligence, or assistance to a declared enemy of the United States. And I don't know if that's the exact language in the Constitution, but this is what the search turned up. And I would just say that China has, as we've documented on this program endlessly, declared war on the United States, declared a people's war. And that doesn't even take into account the preceding, unrestricted warfare activity. This is an open statement that appeared in May of 2019 in the pages of People's Daily the largest Chinese propaganda outlet by far. And it said they were now in a state of people's war, meaning total, all of society war against the United States. If that doesn't constitute a declaration of war, whether we ignore it or not, I don't know what does. And those who are providing material support, and there's any number of ways. Some have, been somewhat innocuous, I guess one might say, or some just, trying to make a buck by using cheap Chinese slave labor, for example, as I think you pointed out, Rod. But let's face it, the transfer of intellectual property, the willing, voluntary transfer of intellectual property, notably by outfits like Sequoia Capital, as well as, various American conglomerates, the transfer of American wealth from Wall Street, clients' accounts, many of them public pension funds, or mutual funds, or the investment funds of, people saving for college or whatever. These have, in the words of Captain Fennell and Sam Faddis, materially increased the threat that we're facing. It will translate into the murder by the Chinese Communist Party if they do go to war with us, or maybe with our allies and we get pulled into it. It will translate into American enabling of the murder of possibly large numbers of American servicemen and women. That does seem to me to rise to the crime of treason. And if it hasn't happened yet, thank God, it doesn't mean it won't. And if we don't call it out, and if we don't, as I said in our book, prosecute these people publicly, shame them for what they're doing, if not actually bring charges and put some of them away, I think that we're going to see just more of this. And the NVIDIA CEO is a prime example of it. He's doing everything he can to end run, it appears, the constraints such as they are that Donald Trump has imposed on the transfer of chips that will enable the Chinese Communist Party quite possibly to win the proverbial AI race, whatever that means. I'm really concerned about this, gentlemen, and I appreciate you indulging in a serious conversation about it against the backdrop of the cumulative experience that we've had over these decades with embracing communist China. And it seems to me it just absolutely must stop. Concluding thoughts, Rob, do you want to go first?
We are at war. It's not a formal war, so there would be some legal gray areas, but there's certainly no legal gray areas where some of these people were effectively bribed. And
you're, by training, a lawyer. Can I just
yeah,
ask you to clarify? Our friend and colleague, Dr. Karen Sigerman, has a wonderful turn of phrase about this. Brian's heard it many times, as you may have, Rod, in which she compares it to the old analogy, the line about if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's there to hear it, does it make a sound? She says, if you are at war and you're not paying attention to it, can you still lose it? And I think that's where we are. We are at war.
And Frank, we keep losing wars for no good reason. Right. We didn't have to lose in Korea, and I guess we didn't technically lose, but we kind of lost. And we certainly didn't have to lose Vietnam. We won in Vietnam, and then we screw it up in the aftermath. And,
the same guy who opened China, by the way, Henry Kissinger.
Well, and I was making the point to you yesterday, I believe, maybe it was Eric Stakelbeck, that, look, Donald Trump isn't starting a forever war with the Iranians. He's ending one. They've been at war with all of their neighbors and us for 47 years. And the American people and the American government ignoring it doesn't mean it isn't true. What would it take? I guess blowing up some more skyscrapers in the United States for people to notice. This is no way to run a country. And I just feel very strongly that Donald Trump agrees with that statement. This is no way to run a country. So there need to be prosecutions of the people that we can actually stick a charge on in an actual federal court. That a treason case is going to be hard in a lot of these cases. A bribery case might not be that hard. Certainly public corruption of various sorts are on the table, and Trump is clearly intent on rooting out public corruption. I think that's probably our best angle to get to this. But again, just, you said closing thoughts. Closing thought is, yeah, we need to take this all seriously. Yes, the Chinese can really hurt us, potentially beat us. Terrible things could happen, but I am optimistic about the path we're on now, as long as we don't screw up and elect Gavin Newsom or somebody in 2028. I think this president and a likely next president are gonna stay on this path. And I think even the Europeans are starting to wake up, at least the French are, which, I hate to ever say anything nice about the French, but, but the French are finally figuring it out. And this is encouraging. So if we can, I believe Trump believes, and I believe it is true, that the Reagan strategy was right. Contain them, cause problems for them on their own turf instead of ours. The Reagan doctrine, and let the internal contradictions of communism collapse the system of its own accord. And in the process, you have the potential to avoid war. We avoided war in the 80s, which is a major miracle. I think we can avoid it here, but I wouldn't count on it. So we better prepare like crazy.
Brian Kennedy, closing thoughts.
Yes, I agree with everything Rod said. That was brilliant. My view is the communist Chinese want to be and are planning on becoming the dominant political military power in the world. That's their goal. They're going to pursue it with everything they have. We need to understand that in the United States. That is not adequately understood among our political elites, and it's not understood adequately by our intelligence community and by our defense establishment. They've long held the view that we're not going to engage in war with communist China, and therefore we don't need to prepare for it. We don't have the Navy, we don't have a missile defense, we don't have adequate offensive forces. Go up and down the list, we don't have what it takes to either win a war or deter a war with communist China, except for at very great losses to the American people. That's unacceptable. We need to have that clarity, Frank, so that everybody understands just what's at stake. And if we did understand that, and we actually had government operational, you wouldn't need to be talking about treason. There would be laws against it. There would be restrictions against what our industries can be doing with communist China. There'd be all sorts of legal apparatus in place to make sure that doesn't happen. We still have a lot of work to do, which is why I want to thank all the members of the Committee on the Present Danger China, most especially you, Frank, for all your hard work in really advancing these ideas with a great deal of skill and intellect that I very much admire, and I want to thank you for that. And on this anniversary of Tiananmen Square, we want to make sure that everybody knows the nature of the Chinese Communist Party, the threat they pose to the United States, and that we, the United States, are going to win this war, whatever it takes. And that starts with the American people. So thank you, Frank, and thank you for all you do.
Brian, thank you. Thank you for those very kind words. It is a team effort. Let me just respond. You said something that I think is in need of amendment. The Chinese are not only pursuing world domination with everything they have, they're pursuing it with everything we have, if they can get their hands on it. And that's the point of this particular webinar, is we cannot allow this to persist because it is a formula for our destruction. I wanted to add my closing thought, which is one that we frequently return to, whether he's with us or not. Trevor Loudon, another of our distinguished members, has a riff that he does on how we can stop this captured elite problem, or at least greatly diminish it. He recommends using the techniques that have proven successful encountering the mafia, RICO statutes and the like, but also specifically the techniques of offering amnesty to people who will basically turn state's evidence, rat out those people up their food chains, whether it's in business or finance or political life or other, areas of activity. Because it is a comprehensive problem. It is a whole of society war, as I said, this people's war, but it's against the whole of our society as well. From, farmers who are selling their land to the Chinese communists without regard for the fact that they're in proximity perhaps to military facilities and they will be used to attack them quite possibly. It's a comprehensive problem, but I think Trevor is right that if you do give people an incentive to expose the treacherous behavior, if not outright treasonous, treacherous, if not fully betraying our country, certainly undermining it, doing material harm to it with a declared enemy of our country. Those are, I believe, prosecutable crimes, and especially if you have the evidence that people who are inside their wire can uniquely provide. So, and Trevor makes the point that you don't need to roll them all up. You need to make some examples. And I think this goes to something you were saying too, Rod. Demonstrate that there are real costs to this kind of misconduct. And yes, Brian, you do need to tighten up laws in some respects. Most especially, you need to overcome the fact that Wall Street, which has probably one of the most powerful lobbies in the country, if only because it's got so much of our money to throw at it, these guys keep prohibiting it from being illegal to put money into China, our money into China. And even when the President of the United States in February of 2025, shortly after coming to office, promulgated a formal policy. It was called the America First Investment Policy. And it explicitly said, we are not going to be investing in Chinese companies, particularly those involved in enhancing the threat we face from the Chinese Communist Party. Well, interestingly enough, that policy was never formally executed. It's on the books. You can find it if you go to the White House, website, but you have to look around for it. But it has not been enforced. And it's high time that that be done, because the practice of embracing communist China is a formula for our doom, and we can no longer indulge in it. And making examples of those who persist in it, even though it is obviously no longer the case that it's in America's interest, even though it is now obviously the case that it will cost us lives. And it may not just be, by the way, folks, men and women in uniform. It could be the rest of us. If the war comes to America, as I fear it will, Brian Kennedy has said on this program as many times, there may be as many as 200,000 Chinese soldiers inside the United States of America at this moment, thanks to Joe Biden's open borders and the Chinese taking advantage of it. Remember what 19 amateurs did to our country, did to our people, did to our economy on September 11th? Imagine if there are hundreds, to say nothing of thousands, to say nothing of tens, let alone hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers, trained, special forces in all likelihood, inside our wire. This is a formula for disaster, folks. We need, in short, your help in taking the work of the Committee on the Present Danger of China. It's all very accessible at presentdangerchina.org. The body of these webinars, I think they've been extraordinarily illuminating, most especially this one. But we need your help, making sure that people who are responsible for securing our country are held accountable for ending the embrace of communist China. the Chinese Communist Party specifically. I hope this program will equip you to do that. I hope you will share it widely with your circles of influence and those who represent you especially, and that you will do it as a matter of the utmost urgency because the hour is very late. So I want to thank all of our colleagues again for marvelous contributions. Captain James Fennell, Sam Faddis, Rod Martin, Brian Kennedy, and needless to say, Oleg Atbashin, who makes all of these things come together beautifully. We're deeply grateful to them and Justin Johnson, our producer at Securing America, for his help as well. But most especially, we're looking to you for your help, and I hope you will provide it in the days to come. God bless you. Over and out.